Hi, everybody. Good morning again. Welcome back. Hope you guys are doing well. Just getting us started. We have about 3 minutes until 10 a.m. when the class starts. But good to see you, whether you're watching this now or on a replay later. Feel free to say good morning or anything else in the chat. And once it's 10 a.m., we will get our little meeting underway for today on Wednesday, September the 9th. I'm playing with these cats over here. You know, you see what's going on. Kitties. Just so you know, they're always around. Oh, I can't really get the camera on Eddie right here. But yeah, he's being a good boy. Oh. Anyway, you know. About another minute and a half. Good morning, Ivan. Good to see you. Hey, Gary. Good to see you there, too. Another minute, and then we're ready to roll. Anybody who's in the chat, just feel free to say hi. It's always nice to check in with you guys. Davis, Abigail, good to see you guys. Welcome to class. Oh, good evening. Yes. 13 and a half hour difference, right? So isn't that true? You must be watching this if it's in a different zone, as I think, at a difficult hour, 1 a.m. Well, let's get it in before bedtime, I guess, right? Nice to see everybody. Jade, Martina, cool. So yeah, just a moment and I'll really get it started. Hi, Parker. Cool. All right, guys. Well, welcome back. Thanks, as always, for your attendance and for your attention and all your hard work in all your classes, but especially this one. Hey, Vlad, Parker, and all the rest. Good to be with you guys. So it's Wednesday. It's the September 9th, at least here in West Coast Pacific Standard Time. Today we're going to continue discussing some of our first topic, the philosophy of religion. I basically want to summarize whatever we did last Friday and then continue from there to finish off with a little bit more on the ontological argument, and then we're going to swing over to the next big argument in this class for the existence of God, which they call the cosmological argument. Okay, so and as always, you know, I'm looking at the chat at all times, so any point in time where like a student has a question or a comment or anything to add, definitely feel free and I'll see it there and I'll respond in real time. Okay, so starting off the class in the philosophy of religion, we're looking at arguments for the existence of God and criticisms that have been placed against those arguments. So the first main argument that we all reviewed is called the ontological argument for God's existence. This was written by St. Anselm about 1,000 years ago in a book called the Proslogion. Let's see, just to sort of survey the general understanding in the class, who could give like even some type of basic description of the idea of the ontological argument? Hi, Chloe. Yeah, like I'm saying, how does the author Anselm make his case that God exists? Who could tell me anything, even if it's not all the details, just even a little brief blurb? Like, what is the main gist of his argument? How does this man try to demonstrate that there's God? Okay, Gary, God cannot be thought not to exist. Yes, but that's a little bit farther downstream. I mean, he doesn't get to that until he first tries to prove that he does exist. That he can't be thought not to is extra on top of that. But you're right. But I'm not just asking what the conclusion is. How does he get to the conclusion? What are the steps? Okay, so like, what are the steps in his reasoning? God has to exist, and anyone who says he doesn't isn't talking about God. Like, yes, Parker, but you're kind of I mean, start the beginning. How does this argument work? God is the greatest conceivable being. Okay, good. And then you're also adding here, Lee, God must exist in both the mind and in reality. To be truly great, God has to exist in this mind as well as reality. Okay, good. Those trio of comments there give a very good, I think, basic demonstration of the argument. So let me just add a couple of the details to remind us of all the little steps. Chloe, your example or your statement is God is the greatest conceivable being and it is greater to exist in both the mind and reality, so he must exist in both. That's very, very good. Yes, very clear. So as he argues, and as you guys are saying, the definition of God is the greatest conceivable being. He says, to who is that the definition of God? And his answer is to everybody. Whether you're a theist, whether you're an atheist, it doesn't matter. Everyone can at least understand that the word God refers to, by definition, the greatest conceivable being. So after that, he adds that some things only exist in the mind, like unicorns or fairies or whatever. But then there are things that exist in the mind and in reality, like me or you or the moon or the planet Earth or whatever. So as he argues, it's greater to exist in both the mind and in reality than to merely exist in the mind. So since God's definition is the greatest conceivable being, he can't lack for greatness in any way. So therefore, he must exist in both the mind and in reality, given his definition and given the fact that it's greater to exist in both. Right. And then after that, Gary and Parker and others who are on the same line of thought, after that, he tries to say, well, God can't even be thought not to exist either. Because if something can be thought to not exist, it's less perfect and less great than something that cannot be thought to not exist. So God, being the greatest conceivable being of all, both must exist in the mind and in reality, and also cannot be thought to not exist. And therefore, the atheist or anyone who says, I don't think there's God, is not really thinking about God, because it's impossible for this thought to be formed, since God's too great for that thought to be formed. Therefore, there's no real such idea of, I don't think God exists. Any person who says of themselves that they think that is just thinking of something else, whether they use the same name or term of God. Okay? Now, after that, we looked at some objections to the argument. The first one was the objection by the monk, Gaunilo. Gaunilo's objection is, I think, pretty simple. He just says, Anselm's argument doesn't work, but if it did, I could use the same tactic in an attempt to try and prove the existence of things that are ridiculous and that we know don't really exist. So he says, here's an example for you. Imagine in your mind the greatest conceivable island. Let's label it the Lost Island. So we have an idea of such a thing, but there's no such thing as the Lost Island. Despite that, what he's saying is that in Anselm's logic, based on that definition, the island must exist, because to really exist in reality is part of what makes something great. So the definition would be violated if this so-called island didn't really exist. Therefore, it must exist. But obviously, we all know that there's no such thing as the Lost Island, despite this inventive example and argument. So any attempt to prove that something exists in reality, just based on an idea of it as the greatest conceivable whatever, is not going to work, okay? Because the island clearly is a no-go. We know there's no such thing as the Lost Island, no matter how we define it as greatest conceivable. So we should therefore, he thinks, not rely on the argument Anselm gives in trying to prove God, okay? And then I think when we left off last time, we finished with the G.E. Moore article. Okay, so one more critic of the ontological argument is G.E. Moore. G.E. Moore's objection is that existence, as he says, is not a predicate. Okay, now just let's remember the basics of that objection. A predicate is a fancy-sounding word for an attribute or a quality or a feature of something. So like my sweater's black. The sweater is the object or subject, and blackness is a predicate or a feature that it has. Okay, it's also a cashmere sweater, so you could say it has the attribute of being made of cashmere or whatever. So attributes are predicates. His claim is that existence is not an attribute. It's not a feature. It's not a quality of something. And that's why he thinks Anselm's argument fails, because what Anselm argues is that to be the greatest conceivable being, you cannot lack for any of the great features. And existence is one of those qualities or features. So being defined as great as conceivable would include it. Now, Moore says that's illogical because existence isn't even a quality or a feature in the first place, which is something that you can explain and understand when you just think about it, how you would never describe something in terms of whether it exists or not. But he uses his own way of trying to make the point. So he gave the example of two sets of sentences where the difference between the two sets is that on the one hand, we've got a predicate in there, and on the other hand, we swap out the predicate for the word exists. The statements are tigers growl versus tigers exist. Some, most, all, and some do not. And when we replace growl with exists, the new sentences formed from the substitution don't make any good sense. Like most tigers growl is reasonable and easy to understand because it just means that if we had a set of tigers, all of which exist, there's a bigger number of them that growl and a smaller number that don't. But we can't analyze the meaning of most tigers exist in the same way because it's like saying, well, there's a set of beings and the majority of them exist and a minority of them don't. But we cannot give numbers or quantities of things that are non-existent as we can when we are just talking about existing things that don't have some feature. So seen through his analysis, existence is not a predicate, and since it's not, it will not serve in Anselm's argument in the way that Anselm wants. Okay, so hopefully that summary is useful to you. I always like to try and make sure we maintain connection with what we just talked about, especially across a long weekend when some of these ideas, of course, can come less solid in your mind. But now that we did that, we're moving on, and we're continuing one more little piece with of discussion of the ontological argument. So there's one more critic, one more objection, and so we talked about Gamillo and Moore's objection. One more to add to that is William Rowe. Okay, so here's the philosopher's name, William Rowe. Okay, so William Rowe is still living, pretty much a contemporary philosopher in the big historical sense, although he's now retired from Purdue University, where he was a longtime philosophy professor. In 1993, he wrote this article that we're about to look at, and it's just called Why the Ontological Argument Fails. Okay, so American philosopher William Rowe from Purdue University, and his article of 1993, Why the Ontological Argument Fails. So as you can see, straightforward title, his overall thesis is that this argument fails, and he's out to show you why it does. Now, I'll give you the big picture of his argument here, and then we'll fill into the details. But the big picture is basically that he's arguing you cannot prove that something exists just by defining it as existing, okay? So you cannot establish that something exists in the external reality outside of your mind just based on a definition of it, even if the definition says that the thing exists. Even if existence is included in its defining features, that definition cannot by itself prove that the thing really exists, okay? So you can't build a bridge from a definition of a word to the conclusion that it really exists in reality. And his real problem with the argument is that he thinks Anselm has just tried to define God as existing, and then like that's all that he needed to do to prove God exists. Rowe says, no, you can't prove that something exists just by defining it as existing. So here's what he thinks Anselm's definition of God is. He's putting it out like this. According to Anselm, God is by definition the existing perfect being. Now, to be fair to Anselm, he didn't quite just come right out and say, hey, existence is in the definition. It took him like a step to get there, because he says the real definition is greatest conceivable being. But if you think about it, that includes existence a couple steps downstream, because it's part of what it is to be great, to exist. Rowe just kind of simplifies and says, look, at the end of the day, he's just defining God as existing. And then it's like he tries to trap you within the logic of the definition, like saying, okay, well, if you say God doesn't exist, now you've contradicted the term itself, because the definition of the word means that he exists. So if you say he doesn't, it's like saying the existing being doesn't exist, and that's just absurd. But Rowe would like to now show the reader that even if you define something as existing, like Anselm has done, that doesn't prove that it really has to exist. Okay, now, to make this point, he uses an example. The example involves two completely invented words made up for the purposes of his explanation here. Okay, so bear with me as I try and explain that. Look at these two words that I'm drawing on either side of this cross. Up here we have magic can. And over here we have magico. So magic can is a word that we have just invented, and what it means is existing magician. Okay, and then the magico, the alternative term here, it's also a made-up word, but what it means is non-existing magician. Okay, so these two words here are just two types of magicians, if you will. This is not a typo. It's spelled magic can here without the I in between the C and the A, because a magic can is a magician that does exist in reality. And a magico is a non-existing magician, like a magician from the realm of fiction or fantasy or just make-believe, okay? So now, I'm going to have you guys help me out to fill in a little bit on either side of this ledger. We're going to start off with the magic can side of the divider. So who are some people who are well known to us who, like, in reality, they practice magic for a living? They perform magic tricks. So I'm just asking you the names, identities of some people who do that. David Blaine, okay. I see your example, Davey. David Blaine. David Blaine, he does a lot of the, like, daredevil escape artist things. Like, he just, flew with the helium balloons over the desert or something. I guess that's magic. Yeah, the Mind Freak, Chris Angel, we've heard of him. He had a residency over in Las Vegas doing magic tricks, you know, at, like, one of the big MGM Grand or something. But I don't know. I guess it's not going on anymore, right, because everything's closed down. But anyway, yeah, Chris Angel, Penn and Teller. Yeah, Penn and Teller, they do comedy, but they mix in magic as well. So that's fine. And you give me David Copperfield. Yeah, he's pretty big in the 90s. Another big one, like famous in history, was Houdini. You guys heard of Harry Houdini? Even though he's not alive now, he was like a flesh and blood person, so that counts. So anyway, these are all following the definition magic can, magicians who existed. Now over here, magico. What could be some examples of, you know, like, give me some names of some non-existing magicians. So magicians, but they're not real people. They're just fictional characters or make-believe, so on. Merlin, that's good. Yeah, so Merlin from the old Knights of the Round Table. That's just fables. There's no real Merlin. Dumbledore, yeah, okay, good. Who else has got anything? I mean, there was Lord of the Rings Gandalf. I don't know, is he a wizard? But it's kind of the same. I've seen students, any other examples you want to throw out there? Non-existing magicians over here, Magico. Any last call? Yeah, sorry for Dumbledore. Got to have another one, no? There's a lot of people here. I know you guys are out there watching movies, cartoons, and other things. Yeah, okay, well, I mean, what? Does Harry Potter count? I don't know, he's like a kind of a magician of sorts. Anyway, the list goes on, basically. We could go on and on, but you get the feeling, right, that there's some magicians that have been real and really lived, and then there have been some that are just make-believe and fictional characters. Okay, now here's where we get to the next part of the argument. Takes a little bit of mental gymnastics, so just try to follow me, all right? Suppose now I want you to imagine something. I'm asking you to imagine what we call a counterfactual, contrary to fact scenario. Imagine that world history took a different track and there never actually were any existing magicians. Okay, so suppose that although in our reality there are these people, that there never had been such people. So for whatever reason, people never took it up and did magic tricks. Now, in that situation, couldn't we still have made this word up, though? Couldn't we still have invented the word magic hand, even in the absence of magicians? You understand what I'm saying? Like, we could have still made up the word, and we could have said, here, this word means existing magician. I say it's the word magic hand. Yes, we could have coined the phrase. We could have stipulated the definition of the word. But in that counterfactual situation, would there have been magicians? No. Okay? So the existence of this word by itself cannot prove that there ever had to be such people. There may be, there may not be, but the word is not the thing that determines whether they exist. Okay? Like, say, for example, taking it in a different direction with my hypothetical, suppose instead of the contrary to fact past history where there never were magicians, suppose that, like, after today there's no longer any magicians. Like, all these people just, I don't know, somehow mysteriously die, and there's no longer any living persons who perform magic tricks. Okay, so after that event, there won't be any existing magicians, but we would still have this word. I could still teach you this lesson in a week after, you know, the assassination of all the magicians, right? And it wouldn't bring them back to exist just because the word has been invented. Are you guys following my train of thought here? I'm trying to present the author's idea that the definition of a word, even if it has existing in it, cannot establish that such a thing really exists. Okay? The magic hand word is being compared by analogy to the word God. What's the similarity in the two cases? As he argues, both are defined as existing, but in both cases, neither has been proven to exist simply based on the definition alone. Okay? Now, I can sympathize with you if you find his example, magic hand versus magico, to be a little confusing, because I can relate to a student who's thinking these thoughts, like, why does he use the case of magic hand, though? There are people who perform magic. Is he saying that there's never been people who perform magic? No, he's not saying that. What he's saying is, just because the word means existing whatever, in this case magician, that by itself is not sole sufficient to prove that there are such beings in reality. Although there are magicians in our reality that correspond to the term, there don't need to be. The term could still retain its meaning. It could still bear the meaning existing magician, even in a scenario in which there are no such things as existing magicians. Does this make sense to you? I would love to know, just because I'm trying my hardest to carry across a little bit of a convoluted example to you. So, looking at the larger back and forth between the ontological argument and Rowe. The ontological argument says the definition of God is the greatest conceivable being, and that means he must exist, because part of being that great is to exist. Rowe says the definition is doing all the work in his argument. The definition says that existence is part of the definition. And then it's like concluded that you can't deny that he exists because that's going against the definition of the word. But in his own example, Rowe says, let me invent a word which means existing something, existing magician. And the point that he's making is that although there are such beings, the word doesn't refer to them in case they don't exist. So if there were no such beings at all, then even though the word would still mean existing magician, there wouldn't be any such things. Now, I'm going to offer you one different look at his argument by slightly modifying the example, okay? Because I think that this example that I've kind of come up with, which makes the same point he's making, is a little bit more clear and understandable to most students, okay? So imagine that I'm giving you these two words now. On this side of the ledger, we have unican. And over here, we have unico. Now, if you're following the lesson and everything, I'm sure you can quickly infer what the definition is going to be of unican. So I'm stipulating this word has a definition. What do you think is the definition of a unican? What could that be? A unican is a what? Make a guess. What could it be? There's a lot of hints. So I'm sure you got it. The unican is the what? Let's go. Let's see it. What is it? Unicorn that exists. Existing unicorn. Exactly, Davey. That's right. So unican, existing unicorn. Obviously, then the unico would be non-existing unicorn. Okay, now let's think of some examples over here. I know there's perhaps not a ton of fantasy fiction that involves unicorns that are known by name, but maybe there's a few. I've got a few that I could throw in there if no one has any. But yeah, let's see what you've got. Can anybody think of a name of a fictional unicorn, a unicorn that's, you know, from whatever stories and tall tales that we've heard, or film, or, you know, media of any kind? Anybody got an example of even one non-existing unicorn, like from those realms? There are a few, but maybe it's not the first thing that pops up to your mind. Let's just see if anyone in the class has got some examples. Usually I get a few thrown out at me from the class. So let's see what you guys have. Unicorns. Give me a unico, non-existing unicorn. Like who? My Little Pony? Okay, good. And Charlie the Unicorn from the internet meme culture a little while back. The Last Unicorn? Ah, good. So we've got some great examples. Last Unicorn film. That was like the main character. Then you've got My Little Pony. Now, what was the names? Rainbow Sparkle or Rainbow Bright? Well, there is one from My Little Pony. I forget the exact name. There was also Charlie the Unicorn, kind of like internet meme humor. Anyway, the list goes on, I assume. There's probably others. If we really wanted to dig around, we could find more. But those are unicorns. Those are non-existing unicorns. Now, over on this side, is there anything that can be written on this side of the ledger? Is there even one name that I can give of a unican? Rapidash? Interesting, yeah. Good one, too. But I'm asking now just about the unican stuff. I think you understand, right? Is there anything that could be put in this side of the divider? Is there? That's a straightforward answer. Let's see if you know the answer. Can I name a unican? Can any of us name one? Yes, the answer is no. We clearly cannot provide any names. And for the obvious reason, why not? Because there are no such things as existing unicorns. Now, imagine that somebody told you, though, but unican means existing unicorn. The word, by definition, means existing unicorn. So once I make up that word, you can't say they don't exist because that's in the definition. Wouldn't that be a ridiculous assertion? You understand me? So even if the word means existing whatever, the world is the thing that determines whether or not such a thing exists or not the word itself. So in our world, there's no unicorns, despite the fact that this word means existing unicorn. Now, hopefully, it's coming into focus, I hope, for you, because the word magican is like the word unican, is like the word God, according to Rowe, at least as Anselm defined it in the ontological argument. In all three of these examples, the unifying bond between them is that we have a word which is defined as something that exists. Existing perfect being, existing magician, existing unicorn. But in this case, I believe it's a very clear example because we all understand there are no real unicorns. And making up this word doesn't alter that reality at all. His example, the one chosen by the author of Magican, it makes this point, but I understand that it's a little confusing because you have to think through a counterfactual. You have to think about, okay, well, in the situation where there weren't magicians, then that word would still be defined as such, but there wouldn't be any things like that. The unican example deletes that one extra level of mental gymnastics because you don't have to transport yourself to an imagined possible world where there's no magicians. Just look at our world. There's no unicorns, in fact. And therefore, I hope it pops and you understand that making up the word unican has not proven or established the existence of these things because they don't really exist. So with God, God may exist or may not, but defining him as existing is not enough to prove it. I can define anything as existing. And if I define something that is non-existent as existing, like in the case of unican, then I just have an empty term that doesn't actually refer to anything real. So that's why he thinks the ontological argument fails. He thinks it fails because it tries to prove the existence of God by defining him as a being which exists. And even if we permit that this is the definition, perfect existing being, that doesn't prove that there has to really be anything that matches this stated definition, okay, in reality. So that would be the point here made by Mr. William Rowe. And let me just read at least one part of his essay, and you can connect it to what I've said here. He says, if we introduce existing into the concept, into the definition of a concept, it follows that no non-existing thing can match that concept. And if we introduce non-existing into the definition of a concept, it follows that no existing thing can match the concept. No non-existing thing can be a magic can, and no existing thing can be a magic co. But must some existing thing match the concept magic can? No. From the fact that existing is included in the definition of magic can, it does not follow that some existing thing is a magic can. All that follows is that no non-existing thing is a magic can. And here's the real key part. If there were no magicians in existence, so now that's the hypothetical, imagine there were none. If there were no magicians in existence, then there would be nothing to which the term magic can would apply. This being so, it clearly does not follow merely from our definition of magic can that some existing thing is a magic can. Only if magicians exist will it be true that some existing thing is a magic can. Okay, and so he says that's the same about God. God is defined as existing being, but it doesn't follow that some existing being is God. Whether some existing thing is God will depend entirely on whether some existing thing is a wholly perfect being. But if no such being exists, then there will be nothing to which the concept applies. This being so, it clearly does not follow merely from the definition of God that some existing thing matches the definition. Only if such a being exists will it be true that this definition corresponds to something real. Okay? So, last word from William Rowe. His problem with the argument is the way that it tries to prove that God exists based on the definition of the word. And he thinks that the definition of God given by Anselm states existence within the terms of the definition. But if that was enough to prove the being exists, then any word invented which means existing blank would serve to prove that it's real. And we know that that's not possible. In his case of magic can, perhaps an oddly chosen example, since there really are such beings, there didn't need to be such just because of the word itself. In my substituted example of unican, I think it just carries through the point very clearly, because you understand there's no unicorns, regardless of whether or not this word has been invented, which has the meaning existing unicorn. So God could be like that. God could be a being which is defined as existing, but maybe doesn't actually exist. At least that's what Rowe's saying, and that's why he thinks the argument hasn't proven what it's set out to prove. Okay, so we can always come back to these things and review them later and talk more. But for now, then, we're closing the book on William Rowe, and we're actually going to move on for the moment from the ontological argument overall into the next big argument for God's existence, okay? So I told you that there's a variety of classical arguments for God's existence that we're going to try and sample from. The first was ontological. The second big one now is what we call the cosmological argument, all right? Okay, so the cosmological argument is an ancient argument. It's thousands and thousands of years old. You'll see versions of it written in ancient Greek philosophy and in global cultures. There are even older versions of it that are from India and from Hinduism and from all kinds of world philosophy. So it's actually quite ancient and well understood and well known, but we're looking at one version of it that was written and discussed by an American philosopher in the 20th century. He's not the inventor of the argument, clearly, because it dates back thousands of years, but he does discuss it and present it again in our relatively modern era. So this is the version of it discussed by American philosopher Richard Taylor. Okay, Richard Taylor lived from 1919 until 2003. And this version of the argument that he's discussing is from 1963. So all I'm showing you here is the title of the argument, the author who's discussing it for us, his dates of life, and the date of the publication of the piece. Okay, so let's try to break down the details then of his argument. So first off, the word cosmological, it's based on the root word cosmos. and that's something that helps us understand and think about the argument a little bit. Let's try and contemplate. What does the word cosmos mean? Anybody have a thought? What comes to your mind? What do you understand by the word cosmos? What's the cosmos? That's a question. Let's see. That'll get us started on this new argument. What's the cosmos then? What could it be? Cosmos? Who's got a thought on this? Good, the universe, Michael. The totality, the entirety of space and time. Okay, so it's the entire universe. Sometimes when I ask the question, an initial attempt will be the stars, stuff that's out in space, which is true, but we are a part of the cosmos too, not just the other stuff that we see from our position, but how we could be seen in principle from the viewing position of other observers in space. So the cosmos is just the whole entire universe. Okay, so the cosmological argument is therefore an argument which is asking, where has this universe come from? What's the cause? What's the explanation for the universe, the cosmos, to exist? What could possibly give an explanation of the existence of the universe? And by thinking about that question, the argument gets us to the conclusion that it has to be God that caused the universe. But we got to go through the steps to get there. So let's go through those steps. All right, now his essay begins with the description of a hypothetical scenario. And that is a hallmark, trademark feature of philosophy, that hypothetical scenarios are given to focus the reader's mind on a particular concept or idea. Sometimes they're called hypothetical scenarios. Sometimes they're called thought experiments in philosophy. You just have to get acquainted with the fact that that's a constant theme in philosophy, the presentation of, in many cases, far-fetched or unrealistic hypothetical scenarios. I understand sometimes students reading that material get frustrated thinking like, wow, how weird is this? How far removed from reality is a situation like this? But I don't want that to be of concern to you, because in this type of scholarly activity, philosophy, these hypothetical scenarios, it's not important that they be realistic. The point is not to present you with a realistic scene or setting, but instead to just focus your mind on a core set of concepts that you need to expand and explain on an argument. Okay, so this is not going to be the last time at all that we are treated to a hypothetical scenario in the class, but I guess it's the first. So here's a situation. Imagine this. You're walking through the woods. That's you. Having a nice little, I don't know what it is, hike, nature, stroll, but you're out there in the woods and you're seeing all kinds of normal stuff to see in the woods, little rocks and brush, trees, soil, vegetation, woodland creatures, flora, fauna. But then there's this one thing that you came across on your walk that's highly unusual to see in the woods. And what it was a sphere. Okay, so you saw a sphere about your height. This here is the light that shines off the curved surface of the sphere. I'm trying to give you a little artistic flair. So now, I want you to imagine that you just were on a nice little walk or whatever in the woods, and among all the normal stuff, you see this unusual sphere in the woods. What do you think would be a normal, typical human reaction to that? Like maybe your reaction. Like what attitude or thought might pop up in your mind for at least a split second when you see this sphere in the unusual setting of the woods? What do you think would be a basic common response or mental reaction? Yeah, curiosity. Good, Davis. Like you'd probably at least pause for a moment and be like, that's weird. Dave, you say touch it, but I think it's kind of in line with the same thing Davis is saying, because why would one touch it? Because they want to investigate or at least see perhaps what it's made of or something, so they can gain a sense of what could have caused it. So a reaction that most all would have sort of similar to you, Parker, the thought, how did it get here? Curiosity, inquisitiveness, wondering things like this. How did this weird thing get here? I wonder what's the backstory or the origin of this weird sphere that's now in the woods? How could such a thing have gotten there? The reason that would trigger these curious thoughts is because it's unusual to see something in that position. Now, when you see things in their normal position, you usually don't have the same kind of curious questions in your mind. Like if you were walking in the woods and you saw a tree, you might not stop, look at the tree and be like, whoa, where did this tree start off? Like, how did this tree get here? Because it's normal to see a tree in the woods, right? Or if you walk into your kitchen, you see the refrigerator, maybe you don't stop and pause and think, whoa, what's the ultimate origins of this refrigerator? Like, how did it ever start to exist? And how did it ultimately arrive in my kitchen? Now, what's being pointed out then is that questions about the origins or the cause of something are usually triggered by the thing being in an unfamiliar setting, right? Like if you were in an art gallery, modern art, contemporary art museum, and you saw this on one of the gallery floors, you might think it's a little weird, but I don't know how you feel about modern art, but you probably would not be like, whoa, what's the origin of it? Because it's normal to see that in an art gallery, not so much in the woods. Okay? So it's only the familiarity or lack of familiarity of an object within its setting that leads to these curious questions and inquiries. But, and this is important, and the author mentions this, couldn't you ask those same questions about things even though they're in an ordinary place? Like even though it's not the most normal thing to do, couldn't you look at the computer, for example, that's right in front of you and ponder the question, what is its origin? You know, what is the ultimate, going way back to its beginnings, that caused this thing to exist? Couldn't you ask those questions about things that are even in their normal place, even though the more ordinary thing is to ask it only when something's unusual? So you hear my question? Like, couldn't a person still have curious questions like those, at least in principle, about even ordinary things in an everyday place? Couldn't that happen? Like, couldn't you ask the question, where did this professor's glasses come from that he's wearing that's lecturing to me right now? Even though glasses on a person's face are pretty normal to see. Couldn't those questions be asked? I need an answer from you. Let me know. Just want to check in with you and check on your comprehension of what I've said. So the question about the sphere, certainly people ask because it's weird that it's there in the woods. But couldn't people, if they were just curious-minded enough, think or ask the same type of questions about everyday things? Sure. And also, even if you don't know the origins of whatever the thing is, whether it's this weird example of the sphere or just, you know, like the watch on my wrist, even if I don't know the answer of like, well, what assembly line did this come from? And what were the raw materials dredged up from the planet that were put into the process of manufacturing it? Like what leads to its ultimate origins? I don't know those facts right now about the watch. But don't there have to be such facts, even if I'm not aware of them, right? Like think of a person. You meet a person, you're like, I wonder who that person's parents are. You don't know who they are, but don't they have to have parents? Yes, even if it's unknown to you. You follow me? So like with the sphere, or anything else, but we're working with this example. If you came across it, you might have that thought we mentioned. Where did it come from? How did it get started? That's odd. And you're not going to have the answer because you're not going to investigate the thing and find out what those answers are. But don't there have to be factual answers to those questions? At least in reality, there had to be a cause of it, even if it's unknown to you. Okay? So all of this initial setup with the sphere example was just to lead us to this principle that he's going to state next, which is called the principle of sufficient reason. So that was all kind of like a precursor that leads up to the statement of this principle. Principle of sufficient reason. And here's this principle. What it says is that in the case of anything that's true, in the case of any positive truth, there is some sufficient reason for it. And I'm going to put it in one slightly modified alternative formulation here. You could also say, in other words, there is a cause or explanation for every fact. Okay, so let me explain the principle in a little more detail. What it says is that in the case of any positive truth, so positive truth is just something that does exist. A negative truth would be the statement that something does not exist. The positive truths are the kind that have to have a cause or a explanation or a reason. Negative truths, no. So like, for example, I have a cat And the fact that I do have a cat is a positive truth because it's something that does exist. Since the cat exists, there has to be some cause of that cat that started it off. Now, if you look around in your room right now, I bet you don't see like, I don't know, like a rhinoceros. So in your immediate vicinity, there's no rhinoceros. That would be a negative truth, that there does not exist in your house a rhino. The fact that there's not one doesn't need to have an explanation, but if there were one, that would be a positive truth, and that would, of course, have to have an explanation or cause. So when something exists in the or for it, that's what the principle says. The sphere example was merely used to illustrate this principle. So the whole example and scenario was just given to try and put this principle on the table that the sphere is the example of, in this case, the positive truth. And according to the principle of sufficient reason, then it must have had a cause, even if the cause is not presently known to you. Okay. Now, to the next step of the argument, to take it a stage further, we have to discuss two different types of truths, okay? Hey, Eddie. So, two types of truths. Okay, so one of the two is called contingent truths. And then the other are necessary truths. Okay, so the contingent truths, first of all, the definition of a contingent truth is something that is true, but that didn't need to have been true. It could have been false in different circumstances if things had played out differently. So things that are true but could have been false in different circumstances. And then necessary truths are truths that couldn't possibly be false, not even in any imaginable scenario. So necessary truths, things that are true, but that could not possibly be false. So they're necessarily true, not just possibly true. Okay, so now with these two definitions provided, I want us to come up with some examples of both. So let's start with the contingent truths. What do you think is a good example of a contingent truth? Something that is true, but if things had gone a little differently, then it wouldn't have been true. It's a lot of stuff. It's almost every event. But let's see what you have in your mind. Example of a contingent truth, anybody? Let's see what you can put on the table. Something that's true, it's a fact, but if things had gone differently, it would not have happened, or it wouldn't have happened that way. So what could be a contingent truth? Let's see. Give me a good example. It's not too bad. It's not hard. Okay, Trump becoming president, that's a good example right there, Michael. It's the outcome of any election or sporting match or anything else is always a matter of chance. It's not a given that one or the other side will be the victor. So though Trump did win, we all know that it was a closely contested election and he did lose the popular vote. So had some of the votes in the battleground states gone differently, then it wouldn't have been President Trump, but it would have been President Clinton. So though it's true that he won, it could have been false if the circumstances had gone differently. Sure, that's one example. So what other examples can we think of? Certainly it can't only be the one example of Donald Trump being president. There's many others, but that's a good one to start with. Having a car, sure. If you have a car, then I'm very happy for you. But if things had gone differently, like you didn't get the monies that you needed for it, or the person who was selling it decided not to offer it to you, or if you had gotten into a crash right after you had it, then maybe you wouldn't have had a car, but you do, let's suppose. Okay? People you become friends with, sure, you become friends with an individual, that's true, then you're their friend. But if you guys didn't even meet or something, if life had played out differently, then that wouldn't have happened. Any of us being born, very good example also, Alec, I like that, and that's true. We're all alive right now, so I guess we're all born. Very good news. Although we are born and we're alive, in every single case, if your parents never met in the past, in whatever way they happen to meet in their lives, then your birth and your attendance at this meeting wouldn't be there. And me lecturing to you, if my parents never met, I wouldn't be here to give you the lecture. So we are contingent truths ourselves. The pandemic, that's another one, right? We're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. Maybe if the initial transmission from human to animal, or from animal to human, hadn't happened, or maybe if there had been some way of preventing it from escaping the original area where it had, developed, maybe there wouldn't have been a widespread global pandemic, but there is. So people walking on the moon, also very good. For almost all of human history, it was just people couldn't even imagine the possibility of humans walking on the moon. But of course, we did achieve it in the late 60s, and a couple of further trips, moonwalks were made in the early 70s. It hasn't happened since, I think, 1973 or 4. But yeah, any number of things could have happened to have made that not occur. The shuttle could have blown up in the sky, or we would have not maybe developed the technology. But we did it. It's something that didn't have to happen, but it did. Okay. Outcome of a sporting match. The Toronto Raptors are the NBA champions. They were not favored to win at all, but they did win. They could have easily lost. Maybe if Kevin Durant didn't, injure his Achilles or whatever in the middle of the finals, we would see a different outcome. Okay, now, necessary truths. Those are things that are true, but they could not even possibly be false. Now, I'd like to ask you guys to give examples of it, but since we're running short on time, let me just give you a few so you have them in your mind before we end. It's stuff like math. It's stuff like geometry, trigonometry, logic. 2 + 2 is 4. That's not like saying, the Union won the Civil War, because that's something that could have played out differently. But 2 + 2 is 4 is not like predicting the weather. It's something that has to be the case, just simply based on the definitions of the numerals and the mathematical operation of addition. That every point on a circle is equally distant from the center. That the interior angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. So these are like formal truths that are necessary. Now, returning to the principle of sufficient reason, these contingent truths are the kind of truths that principle has application to. So in case there's anything that's true, but it didn't need to happen that way, the principle of sufficient reason says of such truths, there must be a cause or an explanation. Because obviously, if it didn't need to happen, but it did, then there had to be some antecedent factors that can explain why it did occur rather than not. Okay, so takeaway point is that contingent truths, according to the principle of sufficient reason, have to have a cause or an explanation. Like you exist, that's contingent, so there has to be a cause. In that case, it's your parents. And the same is true of any contingent truth, that there has to be some initiating cause that brings it into being, since it didn't need to happen. Now, I'm going to leave us with this little preview of the last steps of the argument, and we'll pick up and finish it on Friday. But where he goes from here next is he says, okay, the universe exists. That's true. That can't be denied. That's undisputed. So the universe exists, but the fact that the universe exists, as he argues, is contingent. So since the universe's existence is contingent, that means that though it exists, it might not have existed. It didn't need to exist. And since it's contingent, the principle of sufficient reason says that it has to have what? A cause or an explanation. And that gets us right to the end of the argument, because it takes a few steps from there for him to make the case that the only possible thing that could cause the whole universe is something different from the universe, and something that is not contingent. And that would have to be a necessary being, something like God. Okay? But we will say a little more on this and make sure it's very clear at the beginning on Friday. So just continue reading through the syllabus and the essays listed there. We have a little catching up to do on Friday, but I'm sure we can do it. And if not, we'll make some edits later to the materials if needed. In the middle of next week is when I'll distribute the first paper prompts. So just until then, keep following the syllabus, doing the course readings, attending like you've been doing, and participating, and you should be in okay shape when we talk about the papers. You're going to get a couple weeks to work on them starting next week. All right, guys, so I don't want to hold you. I know a lot of times you have like a little 10-minute window to get to your next meeting. So thanks, everybody, so much for being here today. I appreciate your attendance, as always, and I'll definitely see you back on Friday. So let me know if you have any questions or anything between now and then by email. And till then, take care, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye. Thanks.